Support for Inside Olympia provided by
Geography has made us neighbors. History has made us friends. Economics has made us partners. And necessity has made us allies.
We're all neighbors in one sense or another. What ties us together is what fuels the future of our communities. The Western States Petroleum Association is dedicated to ensuring Americans have access to reliable petroleum products and supports economically and environmentally responsible policies that benefit everyone. After all, we're all neighbors.
I was a straight A student in high school. I actually ended up getting a full ride to Seattle University. I never pictured myself being a heroin addict. My name is Lee Swanson. Helping others has been my solution.
Premera is trying to take a holistic approach to addressing the opioid epidemic. We want everybody to know collectively that we're here to help. We understand people don't choose to become addicted. Let's find the right place for you, and let's just focus on getting you healthy.
This week on Inside Olympia, how will lawmakers fill the hole punched in the transportation budget after passage of Initiative 976? We'll sit down with the chair of the House Transportation Committee, Jake Fye, and the ranking Republican on that committee, Andrew-Barkis. Plus, what's in store for the 2020 legislative session? We'll talk with our reporters panel, Jim Camden of the Spokesman Review and Jerry Cornfield of the Everett Herald.
From the TVW studio, it's Inside Olympia with host Austin Jenkins.
And welcome to Inside Olympia. Happy New Year. The 2020 session is underway. A lot of issues, from homelessness to a ban on flavored vaping products to the governor's proposal for a so-called clean fuel standard, are all on the table. In our second half, we'll break down the issues with our reporters panel. But first, Initiative 976 punched a nearly $500 million hole in the state's transportation budget. So how will lawmakers address this gap? What will they cut, and what are the partisan fault lines? On the program, House Transportation Chair Jake Fye and the ranking Republican from that committee, Andrew-Barkis. Welcome both of you to Inside Olympia. Good to see you.
Thank you. Good morning. Good to see you.
So let's start with the problem statement. I want to hear from both of you. Let me start with the chair. What is, in a nutshell, the problem statement that I-976, the passage of it, presents to you as a transportation budget writer?
Okay, so we're 6 months into a 2-year biennial budget, and we have to close that and reduce the budget by that $450 million. And one of the biggest challenges about this is the funds that are lost through the initiative are what we would call more flexible funds, and they are not like the gas tax, which the gas tax is restricted to roads, ferries, state patrol. So we have to come up with ways in which to deal with cuts to services like public transportation, special needs transportation, in a way that doesn't permanently harm those aspects of the budget, but we have to do our job, which is to live within the budget. Now, it's not like we're not like Washington, D.C., and we're going to try to do this by reducing costs and expenditures, and that's the job that's before us.
Okay. How do you size up the impact?
Well, very similar, Austin. But first and foremost, the initiative passed, so we've taken into account, and we started this conversation even before session started. It's very difficult in 60 days to do what we are going to be doing. So we have to take a hard look at it. And the supplemental year is typically where we're making adjustments, looking at what we did last year in the big budget. And some of those conversations already had happened. But really, it is a matter of finding out where we can make the priorities and where we can look at the agencies for efficiencies, for making some of the cuts within that context. Talking about the revenues, whether it's using existing revenues, shifting those things around. We have some proposals that we're kicking around and doing that. But at the end of the day, we have a responsibility to balance that budget and present a supplemental moving into the next biennia that addresses the shortfalls. So it is going to be challenging, but we're up to the task. We've been doing it a while now, so we think we've got a good plan that we're going to be talking about.
So how is it possible to cut $450 million from this roughly $10 billion two-year budget and not affect services, for instance, for people with disabilities who are relying on certain services.
So that's my hope. That's in my mind, of all the expenditures that is in that revenue budget that's been lost, is to protect the vulnerable. And that means that really is about public transportation, but even more importantly, it's about what we call special transportation. Those folks that need to get to their 3 times a week dialysis appointment, and even the transit system doesn't work well for them in order to get them to their appointments. So that's my number one priority. We have some things, for instance, state patrol expenditures and ferry expenditures that were part of that expenditure plan that we can move to the gas tax. And then also we have in our budget about $85 million that the governor has suggested that we take in, that is sales tax revenue from construction costs, that we could move into that budget to take care of those most important things. But most of this is, I think, going to be about delaying projects and not having the expenditures occur within the biennium, and give us some time on a bipartisan basis to work this next year to come up with some more permanent solutions to the issue.
You know, I think that we both agree, and absolutely, it's about prioritization. So when we talk about this, we're not going to, this should not be viewed as punishing any group or taking away from those who are most vulnerable, and that is something that we want to make sure that we preserve. So the priorities of special needs transportation, those type of things, are at the top of the list. And that is part of the process, going through each and every one of these categories and seeing, you know, these are the set-asides, these are the things that we are going to protect, and then there's the other things that we can start looking at. And, you know, time is the challenge, Austin, because if we had time and the agencies had time, you can really start to dig into those agency budgets and find those dollars, find those efficiencies. And so when we start talking about 10% and we start talking about, the agencies know best where they can find that money and make those cuts. In the same manner that we would be talking as if we were looking at an economic downturn. It's the same kind of a concept, although this is brought on by a different manner. So those priorities, making sure that they're in place first and foremost, going through there is that potential of moving a few things around within the two things, but we also need to look at how do we get at those savings where we can then have a deeper conversation about those projects. I am concerned about delaying these projects. We've heard from a lot of constituents. There are shovel-ready projects that are in place right now. A delay of 6 months to a year could be very detrimental to both funding, material costs, labor costs, and the overall ending of that project. So that does present another challenge as we look at this.
So if not delaying projects, then what? Are you presenting a scenario where you think you could hold harmless both the transportation for the most vulnerable and the future projects and achieve the savings you need, essentially by putting a bit of a squeeze on the agency?
I think that you're going to have to, again, it comes down to priorities of what we're going to be able to do. Because this hit mainly in the multimodal, that is an area where we do have transit, we do have other things, bike paths and the different programs. There may be some things that we need to pause in that aspect that are not as critical as some of these projects, as a road project, as a bridge in, say, Richland that's falling apart.
So where does the Democrat who chairs the committee come down on this?
To be clear, and I think it was embodied in the work, and albeit the governor doesn't have as much time to deal with this as we do, and that's our job, is to decide on the final budget.
Yeah, the governor presented his own
right,
quote-unquote
and
fix.
he did the best job he had with the time that he had, but it's now we dig deeper into this. So part of this is, quite frankly, is we need to take a look at the assumptions about what the agency thinks they can spend. We passed in 2015 Connecting Washington, right?
It's a 16-year, $16 billion
Right.
road building, bridge building.
And my initial look at this, Austin, is that there's challenges for WashDOT and other folks that are funded, local governments or whatever, to spend the money, right? So we always have under expenditures. And so, but I think in this case, we can in a normal budget year, we wouldn't be so worried about it. This year, I think we have to take a look and go back to the agencies and say, okay, you gave us your best. Now tell us what you really are going to spend in the rest of the biennium.
Now, of course, I-976 is under court challenge before the Supreme Court. You're not expecting a decision on its constitutionality before the end of the session, and you, along with the governor, are presuming that it's going to be upheld. That's sort of your working assumption for purposes of budgeting. That said, the voters delivered you a bit of a problem here, a hole in your budget. On the other hand, to flip this on its head, you are proposing to, in essence, reenact I-976 at the legislative level to put $30 car tabs into law by the legislature. Why? Especially if it's creating the headaches it's creating.
Well, Austin, it's because the voters and the constituents that we talk to are frustrated. They're tired of the continual costs. And you know, this initiative passed years ago, and we had the $30 car tab for a period of time. And then you saw the addition of fees and weight fees and this and motor vehicle and ST 123, and pretty soon it ballooned. And as a reaction, they said no more. That was the essence of this. We feel we need to listen to the voters. We need to listen to what they're telling us to do. That's why we're proposing, similar to what was done by Governor Locke years ago, to pass this initiative in its legislative form, and then move from there, because that is what the voters have told us. It's the will of the people. So it's, even though it presents a challenge, and yes, I mean, we look at this like, okay, but that's what we're here to do. I mean, we need to work within the constraints of what the people of the state of Washington want us to do. And they sent a pretty clear message that that's what they want us to do.
But, yeah, go ahead.
So, I'm from Pierce County, right? And they've been sort of the poster child for what the vote is. But if you look at the vote results, it's kind of a mixed bag, right? My district is in Pierce County, and my voters voted to reject the initiative. And if you looked at the numbers for all those, many of those advisory ballots, similar kind of numbers. So yes, you can say it's an off-year election, different numbers of voters turn out in off years versus general elections, especially a presidential year. So yes, there is some concerns. But I'm not convinced myself that to simply enact what was put together by Mr. Iman is the best solution. Snowmobiles, right? There's the tax that they asked for to groom ski trails, right? That was wrapped into the initiative. I don't know that the voters knew that would be reduced, and now they have a shortfall. The money that goes to local governments who are strapped, who only get options to do things based on what the legislature authorizes them to do, they've got problems in order to meet their local needs in this. So I'm not going to say that we won't come back at some point in time and make some adjustments, but my focus is making sure that we do the cuts in the least possible harm to the vulnerable, and to set up, because we're going to be reviewing this in the next year, to set ourselves up for the 2021 session to do a comprehensive look at revenues and projects, because we still have a court case, the U.S. Supreme Court case to pay for culverts. Sure. We've got we've got a Columbia River Bridge that needs to be replaced. We're going to need to spend more money on transportation, not less money. But we got to really take a hard look in this interim period about where we get our revenue and what the best way to raise it is.
I think it's a safe bet that under majority Democrats, the $30 car tabs is not going to be reenacted this session. I think what you referred to is it was a previous initiative was thrown out by the courts and the legislature. I think maybe even came into special session under Locke and reenacted. Of course, if you did do that, then it begs the question, well, where would you get the money from? And you have a proposal on that front too, which is to take the sales tax money from automobile sales and direct that away from the general fund and put that into transportation projects. We've heard this proposal before. I want to hear your argument for it, and then I'll hear the argument against it from the chair.
And I'm happy to, but you know, I would like to just follow that, 33 out of 39 counties passed this initiative. Pretty wide margins. There were areas in Pierce County and others that I would agree with the chair that had that because of the impact on it. But But that's a pretty clear message. So I think that's
because Sound Transit 3 passed in the vote, and then you got the statewide vote. And
it passed, and then people realized what they passed, and it's very similar to this initiative that passed, and people realized. And there are a lot of things, but when in the process, if that bill, say it went through the whole process, came to the floor, we would have an opportunity to amend. We would have an opportunity to make changes, and there are a lot of agreements between the two of us on things that it picked up that kind of scooped in that maybe should not have been scooped in.
Let me push back on one other idea. Let's just say you want to get to a fixed car tab, so people have a reliable, here's what I'm going to be paying. In 2020, $30? Really?
That's actually $38 or something, so whatever it is.
I mean, it's like, has there been any inflation since the 90s that would,
there has been,
I mean,
here and there, but Austin, is it 30, is it 50, is it 60? What is the thing? 30 was the number that was put forth, 30 was what passed. That's the start point. And we have the opportunity as legislators to amend, to make the decisions. That's what we are tasked with doing. So we will do that. Now, let me get back to this. So there is a natural nexus between the sales tax on the purchase of motor vehicles and the transportation world. And so this proposal came up last year. Representative McEwen had a proposal. Now with this passage, we've looked at it and said, it's time to really think about this. The general fund operating budget has had very healthy surpluses, and of course with what we did last year with many increases, the revenue to be able to deal with shifts of different funds. We see this all the time. This would create a 10-year phase-in of taking that sales tax portion and applying it to the transportation budget. Now, we have proposed to allocate that account for preservation and maintenance. As the Secretary of WSDOT said, that is one of the most critical areas.
We haven't done a good job in the state of that. We like to build new things, not so good at preserving and maintaining the old stuff.
So this is about $171, $172 million in the first shift. And then it goes over the period of time that money comes into the transportation budget, into a dedicated account. We feel that is very doable. We feel that the conversation should be between the budgets, both sides, to look at that. Of course, the pushback is, we're just moving things around and we're going to blow a hole here, and now children won't have this. It's a false argument, Austin. This happens every budget cycle. Things are shifted, things are moved around, and again, I think it comes back to something we talk about, and that is really what are our priorities. If this is a priority, this money can go over here, and maybe some of these other programs and some of these other things that are in the operating, we don't do at this point in time, or we find other ways to fund those.
So why not? I mean, I think a voter could listen to this and think this seems like a really practical solution.
So tell me, Austin, what was in the initiative? It included a 0.3% tax on car sales. So were the voters voting against the car tabs? Were they voting against the 0.3% sales tax on sales of automobiles? So I could take a message from the voters that they don't like the tax on car sales either, and because they repealed that as it relates to the transportation budget. So I'm not going to say that. I think like I said, we have to take a look at the big picture about the revenues, and certainly there's an argument that there's a nexus between car sales and the transportation budget. We just solved over many, many years, as you're familiar with, trying to get education funding. So, I guess I'd ask the other side specifically, are you going to raise other taxes to make up the difference you take from the operating budget? Or where are you going to cut in the operating budget? Because the needs in the state are increasing on the operating side, just like they are on the transportation side. So where's it come from?
Okay, a quick rebuttal.
The rebuttal would be, yes, there was a portion in the initiative that did repeal. This is the sales tax that was not affected by that. This is a sales tax that's been in place for years and years and years on the sale of motor vehicles. That's the portion we're talking about. And in Austin, we passed, I can't even remember how many billions of dollars of new tax increases last year to fund everything, all sorts of different things. I think that we as a body can look at this without affecting the work that we did on education, without affecting some of the critical areas. But Austin, if we're going to get into talking about what the budget has been proposed by the governor, there's increases in there in the transportation. There's bonding. There's all these different things. I think that's a more responsible way to look at existing revenues now, the sales tax, utilizing that as opposed to new revenue. I agree 100% with the chair that we will be having a much larger revenue conversation for the bigger picture items.
Well, maybe let's do that for a moment, because once you get out of this hole and you head into 2021, you will be looking at, and regardless of what happens with 976, there's a lot of pressure right now on the system, the transportation system, and on your funding mechanisms. Right. The gas tax is a declining source of revenue for you. There has been some talk and some study about moving to a vehicle miles traveled. Road usage charge, certainly we're implementing some tolling. Electric cars obviously don't fill up at the tank, so that's not going to get you any gas tax revenue. Let's start to talk a little bit about what the future might hold. And maybe I'll start with, when is the next big transportation package coming? That's been typically every decade.
Right.
But is that timeline speeding up a little bit?
Well, the Senate, Chair of the Senate Committee, Senator Hobbs, introduced a package last time, right? And my intention is to introduce a package in 2021, because we do not have $3 billion of fungible funds to take care of culverts, which is a legal obligation that we have. The court settlement on salmon recovery, that washout roads are blocking the passage, their culverts are blocking the passage of salmon, right? And
it's a big liability.
And I've spent 4 or 5 days already down working with other legislators in Washington and Oregon of talking about the need for a replacement for the Columbia River Bridge before something devastating happens and that vital connection is no longer usable. So I believe, being, the sensible kind of person, not to say that the Republicans are not sensible, but I think this takes a good deal of conversation. And I think road user charge has to be part of that conversation. Now, I don't personally think that that's something that can be implemented in 2021. That's going to take some time. It's going to take some work.
Could it be, let's just say, for sake, because I've been here for a while and I've seen sort of how this place works. So I think you said it was Connecting Washington was 2015, is that right?
Right.
Okay, so let's stick with the decadal cycles here. Let's say you pitch your idea in 2021, but it takes a while to get the support for it. It takes to 2025. You may not want to wait that long, but by then, could road usage charge be ready for prime time? I mean,
yes, it would be closer, and my hope is that we will get some more federal funding to do some more trials of that. Yeah. That's being done in several states, and I think we need to have more work to do. I think one of the big issues for our caucus is, how does this work for people on limited incomes? How does this work with respect to privacy?
People are willing to carry their devices with them and give up a lot of privacy, but it's a very different conversation when it's government.
Yeah.
Yes.
Where am I driving?
Right. Where am I driving? Yeah. Although somebody knows that.
They already know.
They already know. But so two issues have been raised. One is the timing of the next big transportation package, and then how are you going to fund it? And is a road usage charge or vehicle miles driven going to be the future?
I think that you indicated something that it is usually in the decades. It takes a long time. I wasn't here in 15 and came in the next year.
Right. But for things to kind of
but it does take a long time. Policy takes years to develop. I'm doing housing policy that's just now coming, and it's been taking 2 years to do. But our state is growing very rapidly. Yes. We have pressures that we haven't had. From 2015 to 2020, things have changed dramatically. So the timeline has been pushed, and that is agreed upon. In addition,
which I think is just a pause. I think that is significant to hear from both of you saying that maybe we've been able to get by doing these every decade, and it's always a really tough sell. But I'm hearing from both of you that the pressures, such as they are, and the growth in this state may require speeding up that timeline. So go ahead.
1 million new people in the last 10 years.
Right.
And it is. In aging infrastructure, all those things compound over the Columbia River crossing is a classic example of that, because these compound over time. They 2015 to now, it's aged 5 more years, and it's much more critical. And so within the conversation, we say, and this was a big piece of the 2015 package, reform. We need to look at how things are being done. How can we do things more efficiently? How can we lower the cost of these projects so we can do more? So you've got to look at both sides of the ledger, and in business sense, expenses and income. The revenue piece, the road usage charge is very controversial. I'm not in support of it as it exists because of how it affects the entirety of the state. There are more things to come from that. How do we address the privacy? How do we address the implementation? What's it going to cost to do that? All those different things. So it is on the table. It has to be. It has to be along with other various.
Is there anything else though that you could go
well,
to?
There's more. There's tolling. There's fees. We had a very
But the
good.
fees will be repealed at the ballot.
But there is. The chair did a very bipartisan green transportation bill last year, and there were fee increases in there with regards to electric vehicle. And these are things to support that growing infrastructure and the need as it's moving forward. It shows a pathway. It shows an ability to do that, and I think that was good work that was done. So as we look at this, everything is going to be. But going back to that JTC, that needs study that's being done right now. Is critical. It's very important. It's very bipartisan. It is bringing all these things in to really look at it, and then also look at that revenue piece that is going to be there down the road, so that we can assure that people will stay moving in the state of Washington for the next 10, 20, 50 years. So
we can't wait past 2021.
Okay. You did not like my suggestion that it's going to take
We've had the conversation in our caucus about that we have to have something ready in 2021, because in particular we have a 10-year window to get the work done, and we don't want to get in the situation that we were with the True Blood case as it relates to mental health, right? And having other folks decide for the legislature how we're going to do things. I think that Representative Barkis is absolutely correct. I was part of the negotiating team on 2015. There needs to be, wherever we can find reforms to do things in a more efficient fashion, we have that obligation. And that's what we do. I mean, we have 7 members, 4 Democrats and 3 Republicans, that get together 3 times a week to go through the budgets. So we need to make sure that we're spending the money correctly, and that's what we do.
If I may, I could give you another example too, because the culvert issue, it has been a big one. And we spent a lot of time this interim traveling the state looking at culverts and talking about it. In our perspective, I think there's agreement. We have looked at, and there is a piece of legislation even I'm putting forth about how to prioritize this. How do we look at the projects and the cost? Why does it take $500 million to design all these culverts and different things? We also have 10 years. So, one of the things that we think is, the governor moved some money around last year after we were done with all the work we did. So maybe that should not be moved around so we could address this 976. It's another thing to be thinking about. But over the course of time, how do we do that as efficiently as possible to address true salmon recovery? Not just the projects, the WASDOT, but the overall up and downstream piece of that. So I think it's a good example of how that reform comes in and how that conversation comes into play as we're looking at these things moving forward.
What is, I want to ask you about rail and its role going forward. So I have 2 thoughts in my mind. One is we saw the Amtrak Cascades crash, a terrible incident. Lives were lost, and it happened on the inaugural run of what was supposed to be sort of the, kind of representative of the future, right? And we still haven't gotten back to using that line, and the cars that we're using on the Amtrak Cascades are, not safe enough. And then sort of the other thought in my mind is, what about the kind of rail we see in Europe or in Japan, where you can get places quickly and it goes great distances and high speed and sort of that shiny future? I mean, if we can't even keep the trains we've got on the tracks, and yet we're in gridlock and there's talk of the future, like what's reasonable and realistic to expect?
Well, what's realistic to expect is the governor proposed an expenditure. We were more conservative in the expenditure for high-speed rail. because there's a lot of fundamental questions. Governance is one of them, because we're talking about an international rail line. And then there's the big question is how you're going to pay for it. Yeah. And so we have to, it's going to have to go slow. It's going to have to be a slow walk. I'm not going to say that this is not going to, I think our responsibility is to look to the future about how we can grow the economy and keep a lot of good jobs in this state. But in the context that we're in, especially the 976 context, we got to do the basics first, right? People want to count on having a transportation system that's safe and well preserved, and that it meets the growing needs that we have now, and that's what the priority has to be.
So, I'm Chair of the Rail Caucus, have been working on the rail issues for a long time. We have in existence, and we have had for over 25 years, the Cascade Corridors, which was intended to be a higher speed intercity passenger rail service. It has performed flawlessly for years, safe for years. The accident was a tragedy. There was mistakes made on many different levels. But Austin, we have been sitting for 2 years now with that bypass not being in use. It is a priority for me to see that back in use. The taxpayers spent almost $200–300 million to do that section of rail. It should be in place. WSDOT is working with Amtrak and others to make sure that we do have the equipment. We're supposed to have 6 trains running right now between the two major cities and into Oregon. That's not happening. So there are things happening right now. We're hoping to this early spring to see that back up and running. But the real thing is we can look at using the existing service that we have, improving upon that, improving grade crossings and efficiencies to be able to move people up and down that corridor. It's a natural tie-in to what exists with light rail from Lakewood and up, the Sounder service. So there is that ability. Having a high-speed rail would be wonderful, but we are not China. We're not going to see that. We have something called private property and property rights and different things that you don't see that in China. It takes years and years to acquire right-of-way. That's why California went from a $20 billion to $100 billion and now stop on their particular high speed. So I think it's not very responsible right now to be talking about an $80 billion shiny, train that would increase when we already have the corridor to be able to use if we put the resources there. And again, that is another conversation once we address the priorities that are being done. So.
And in fact, Representative Barkis has been great about leading the conversation on rail, and we have another study to take a look at whether we can serve Eastern Washington better through expanded use of existing systems. So I think, it's heavy rail, runs on a different line. It's not on the freeway. It's another way of getting there. And so we really need to maximize to the extent we can and accommodate freight to maximize and to get the most out of that system that we can. And that's where that's part of the basics of sound transit is to use that transportation system to get people into their jobs.
So just a few seconds left. I want to conclude sort of where we started. I asked you to state the problem statement around the impact of I-976. Now, just very briefly, as you look to a solution, how much pain is there going to be, or how much can you avoid the pain and deal with this in a way such that, for the most part, people aren't feeling the impacts, at least immediately, with this shorter term problem? What's your sort of, what are you telling your constituents? What are you telling the public?
Well, I get that for some people it's a problem, and that in terms of timing of projects that are out there, and we're going to take a look at that and what the governor did. But the voters spoke, and until we have a different resolution, we told them that there would be cuts, and so there will be some pain for this. It's a matter of if it's a pain of having your project delayed, or it's a pain of not getting the transportation to your dialysis appointment. Those are two different things. And from our standpoint, we've got to make sure that the vulnerable and people who are having to commute a great distance to get to their jobs that don't get a big high pay for that, who have to rely on the transit system to get to their jobs. A lot of people in Pierce County are that way. We have to make sure that we've got a viable transit system. So but we do things together. Transportation's a bipartisan, and it'll be a compromise in the end about how we address this issue.
Well, and I would say the good news is that the chair and I work very well together, and we want to put the policy over politics, and to really get at that. I hate to hear the word pain, Austin. I think that is sometimes we hear that, and there's a fiscal responsibility. There are those things. I mean, we've seen ups and downs in our economy over the course of time, cuts and increases. I mean, that's just part of the thing. But I really think that we can do a good job in prioritizing, making sure that those most vulnerable have those services, those projects that need to be put into place, and we do our due diligence and our best that we can do for the citizens of Washington to make sure at the end of the day we have a product that honors the will of the voters and also takes care of the issue at hand.
Okay, State Representatives Andrew-Barkis and Jake Fye, thank you both for coming in to talk about this. Good luck in the ensuing days and weeks.
We'll see you in 60 days.
Yes, exactly. And when we return, it's a short legislative session, but the list of issues in play is long. We break down the upcoming session with our reporters panel. That's next. And welcome back to Inside Olympia. From the controversy over State Representative Matt Shea to pressing problems like tackling homelessness, lawmakers have a lot on their plate this session. It's a short 60-day election year session, and already partisan differences are emerging. It's also a historic session with the election of the first woman Speaker of the House. Joining me now to talk about the 2020 legislature is our reporters panel, Jerry Cornfield of the Everett Herald and Jim Camden of the Spokesman Review. Great to see you both. Thanks for being back. So first impressions in the first few days here. Obviously, Monday, day one, was significant because of the election of and the swearing in of Lori Jenkins as the first woman, the first openly gay Speaker of the House in the state. There were many members, at least on the Democratic side, wearing white, as was she, to commemorate the 100th anniversary of women's suffrage. But Jerry, let me start with you. Just impressions about that, and also just the changing of the guard. I mean, after 20 years of Frank Job.
I mean, the tone, the mood is just different. There's, when folks say it feels more open, conversations are more open, I mean, it is. We've had more conversations with now Speaker Jenkins in the past week, maybe the past month, than we had in several years with Speaker Chop. Although it's going to be a different style. And we also had a opening day speech that didn't talk about one Washington, but talked about a unity of a different way and moving forward. So
inclusiveness, equity, yeah.
And so just the approach. Yeah. Now, clearly, we've got now whatever it is left, in 50 some days left. We'll see where, I mean, it's tough running that caucus. There's 57 people with 57 minds of their own. And she has some big challenges to look and wrestle with. Even if 50 of them want to do something, she has to now decide, as Frank Job did for 2 decades, do we do it? And those are some big, that'll be hard.
I wrote, Jim, that one of her first tests is going to be what to do about State Representative Matt Shea. They've got this report that they've been handed that says, that's concluded that he's got close ties to militias, that he was involved in planning and executing the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge. He is saying this is a lie, that he's been accused of domestic terrorism, a crime, and has had no due process. He's obviously been, by his own caucus, he has been suspended, removed from his committee assignments. So in many ways, he's been kind of relegated to the literal back bench, yet he's still here. So now they have to decide, and she has to decide, do they pursue expulsion? And if they do, and they don't have the Republican votes to do it, is it worth going through the process? I would think that this is going to be a really serious decision for them on just how to proceed.
And I expect them to be talking about it all this week. I talked to one of the Spokane members on the opening day to say, well, what have you decided about Matt Shea? And he said, well, today was all about Lori Jenkins. So we didn't really talk about that in caucus. We're going to have to get to that. But I mean, they have a tough decision, because to expel a member of the House, you need a 2/3 vote. So that means they need at least 9 Republicans to go along if they get all 57 of the Democrats, which isn't a done deal, even though there are quite a few Democrats that are very angry about the results of this investigation. The Republicans have said, we've done everything we can do. We're in the minority. We expelled him from our caucus, but now it's up to the Democrats to make up their minds. I think some sort of hearings would solve a couple of things. One, it would give the Democrats a chance to see how far this can go. Second, it would give Matt Shea a forum to say, I get to present my side of the story, because he's the one that's talking about a lack of due process, and his supporters were here on opening day with signs, "We stand with Matt Shea." So I think that something will happen, but it's going to have to happen pretty quickly, because it's a short session. They have some budget problems. They have some transportation problems, and they're going to have to get on to the business of governing pretty quickly.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to compare this to a presidential impeachment, although Shea has, but we know that when this kind of thing happens, it does take a lot of oxygen out of the room. It gobbles up a lot of time and attention. So I could see them weighing whether he's also up for election this year. I could see them saying, well, maybe let the voters call this one. But thoughts on where they might be headed, and if they did pursue expulsion, just how that would affect the dynamic.
As Jim has said, I mean, a hearing offers, and first off, the Democrats, the sense that they could overplay their hand here, because if they don't expel, and they've been talking about it, although the political ramifications come November, I think will be minimal on most Democrats, even if they do nothing. But a hearing would allow them to say, look, you, the taxpayers, paid for this report.
And it wasn't cheap.
And so what we're going to do, we're going to bring these folks here. They're going to lay out the findings. We're going to ask our questions. I think a question will be whether or not, if they allow Representative Shea to respond, which seems likely, if they would, then the entire, maybe all of those in the public, and we could have a real show for a day. But then they could be done with it. Everyone could have their say, and they could end with, we did send it to authorities, federal authorities. Now it's in their hands, and if something happens down the line, it can come back to us. So that would seem like a natural course of action. But they need to do it not only early, but they need to do it at a point where they have other agenda issues they want to talk about. They can't do it too close to the budget or so, because then it'll become a chit, which if you want to do your hearing, you're not going to get this and not going to get that, or we're going to stall and delay on the floor.
Well, the first panel was, we talked about transportation funding, the impacts of I-976, the $30 car tab measure, which of course is in court, tied up in court, being challenged. But in the meantime, they've got to do something about the hole that this has punched in the transportation budget. You're reporting in Snohomish County, part of the Sound Transit region. What's your sense of kind of, both the mood of voters and the mood of lawmakers around 976 and transportation?
Well, we've looked at the numbers, and with the exception of the city of Edmonds, the voters all supported 976. And some of that is the backlash to the very proposal that passed for the Sound Transit.
Right, Sound Transit 3, which was voter approved, right, but also raised car tab fees significantly.
I mean, people are furious, and they're furious about the cost that they're spending, and they want change. The lawmakers, at least on the Democratic side of the aisle, seem to be giving lip service to that. They've been the majority. They could make the decisions. They could change the law to make Sound Transit do something different sooner than they would. Right now it's like 2028, but they haven't. The Republicans are using this issue to say, the will of the voters is being ignored. And so the thing that struck me yesterday when listening to the Governor Inslee's State of the State is he didn't mention it at all. He has talked about it, but he left it off the table completely. And his departments have been wrestling with this issue and delaying projects, taking action. So it's a little surprising that the leader of the state didn't at least acknowledge what the voters said and what he wanted the legislature to do about it.
Well, he's basically punted the ball to the legislature, since the governor likes to use sports metaphors, and by creating this pause in funding for some of the projects, some very big projects, and as they are pointing out in the transportation committees, that pause is on paper that's until July 1st. But if you wait until July 1st to start letting contracts, then it's 4 or 5 weeks in before you can get all of the specs out, and then another month, and suddenly you lose the entire construction season. So it might actually be a year-long pause. So basically, this has put a lot of power in the two transportation committees on what are we going to do, and they're going to have to come to some understanding between the two parties as to what can we spend money on, and how do we wait until the courts decide this, because they're going to be gone before the courts decide this. They may need a special session in the fall if the courts say, no, Initiative 976 was fine.
And the mood of the voters and the mood of the public and Republicans is going to be interesting, and some Democrats, because a question came up in the Senate Transportation Committee of the governor's transportation team of what's happening with the money that's coming in, this escrow account. And it turned, they said, there really isn't an escrow account. We're keeping track. So there's a ledger. There's someone with a ledger somewhere tracking the money.
What they did with the McCleary
Right.
fines?
We kept saying, well, where are you putting the McCleary fines? Well, we're just keeping track of it. Well, the budget's big enough that you can do that. You don't have to take a pile of $100 bills and put it in a safe over here. But it does start to add up.
Good. I would say it's different than McCleary too, because they don't know the amount, right? How many people are paying each day? So there's already a distrust building that in the end the government is going to use a number saying that's how much is there, but they aren't going to actually be able to show their work, if you will. And so then there's going to be
On the other hand, they do need to be prepared to issue those refunds if the initiative is upheld by the courts. So you mentioned, Jerry, the governor's State of the State address, which is the other sort of big formal event of the week, and I just want to come back to that. Other impressions, besides the fact he didn't mention car tabs, 976, the transportation budget, he's running for as I said, a nearly unprecedented third term. And at the same time, we've seen polling out this week that seems like his popularity has taken a real hit, even since his presidential run. Just the tone and tenor of what he was saying, and also the substance of it. What thoughts and impressions?
Over time, yes, listening to it, and as the hours wore on, it just felt in the end underwhelming. I mean, usually I would anticipate an election year speech might be full of vision, and this was full of, hey, there's two things that we need to do, let's do them. And then it was just a brush up.
And climate change.
Right. And climate change has been there every year. I think there was one state of the state that he didn't mention it.
A lot of focus on what has been done previously, which is interesting.
Right, yeah. I mean, part of it was a victory lap, which is good for the Democrats in the room because they voted for all that stuff. A lot of it, the Republicans did not vote for. And so, but it serves as a resume for a third term. But it was, it was almost like a State of the Union address because he had folks in the gallery that he had stand up, and they were from all over the state, so no area was left behind. But I was struck by the fact that it realized for a rare State of the State address that this is a short session and there's a limited number of things you can do, so let's concentrate on homelessness, and then he mentioned climate change, but the clean fuel standard, is not a tax, at least. So.
And then those two issues, his approach on both issues, and a bit demonstrates how has been his entire 2 terms, is an approach that is at odds with the legislature. These were not even winning approaches, so therefore there were not applause lines in the speech, even for how other than there was a good number of House Democrats applauding on the low carbon fuel standard idea. But on the 2 issues that he says are important, especially homelessness, which I think everybody agrees it needs to be addressed in some way, shape, or form, couldn't get a standing ovation for an idea on how to deal with it.
That idea to tap the rainy day fund, which takes a supermajority vote and doesn't appear to have the support it would need to pass. He said in his speech he's agnostic about where the funding comes from. What he wants, though, is for the legislature to free up a significant amount of money. I mean, he's talking about $300 million over 3 years. Mm-hmm. But to really take a significant step towards reducing the number of people who are living in tents, living under tarps, the unsheltered homeless is the term. Cut that in half over the next 2 years. It's a fairly ambitious goal.
But I mean, it is the one thing that I think you can get support for, because there aren't very many places in the state that you can go and not see the unsheltered homeless, the people in the tents and the tarps and the cardboard boxes. I mean, it's worse than any place else in Seattle along I-5 and some of those places. But I mean, you see it in Spokane.
We're seeing it here in the state capitol.
Sure, it's just down the street.
Just down the street. I mean, it's really, I think, like you say, pretty much anywhere you go, it's visible.
Right.
And how people are reacting. And this is the other thing I'm noticing, though, and I've been hearing on the one hand that there's a lot of bipartisan work happening around homelessness, like there has been on behavioral health, but I'm also hearing rhetoric that starts to make me think that this has become a partisan issue, or at least that that people have their perspectives, and based on those perspectives, what they think the approach should be, and it's
there
sort
was
of
definitely that yesterday in the Republican presser after this, right? Because they said, well, we have some ideas, and this is what we'd like to do, but in exchange for this, what we want is no safe injection sites, and they had another.
It was limiting the camps to
right,
within 500 feet.
Within 500 feet of schools and parks and
so
things
forth,
like that.
yeah.
So, and as you pointed out,
and John Braun, the Senate budget lead in the Republicans, I was talking about sort of a more law and order approach, or maybe carrot and stick. I don't know, but just if people services are available, people need to avail themselves of that, and if they're not, so that's sort of one perspective is we need a little bit more of a hammer, perhaps. And others who are on the Democratic side who are saying, look, this is a really complex problem, and you've got to look at the pipeline, from the street all the way to the permanent housing. It's going to take multiple years, and anything that's going to require. So, yeah, it just starts to feel a little. Once
you start saying it's going to take multiple years, the people who are confronting it right now are going to say, no, we need it right now. And that's, I mean, we saw an election in Spokane where homelessness was an issue, and there was the question, the mayor's race, and the question was, well, do we need this multi-level approach, or do we need to get tough? Do we need to throw some of these people in jail? Essentially, is what it came down to. We need to throw some of these people in jail is the candidate that won.
And that's what I'm wondering, if that's where the conversation here is going to get to, versus eclipsing the partisanship and the doctrine around this. And finding bipartisan compromise.
Well, I think a problem they may run into too, and it's are there going to be strings attached? Because the local governments and the nonprofits are going to be pressured to do it.
And it's also, is it a local problem or a state problem? What is the state's role? And I mean, I was asking the governor, like, why haven't you called out the National Guard? Which is it's a somewhat rhetorical question too, because there's many things you can do, but sort of that level of emergency, does the state now, has this eclipsed the local communities? And then we're also hearing, though, no, let's just give the local community some more taxing authority and let them figure it out.
But give it to them with strings. But do it the way we want you to do it. So,
running low on time here, but let's just hit a couple of other issues. The question of gun control measures. The governor, the attorney general have both endorsed the idea of eliminating magazine capacities, banning so-called assault weapons. There's also a bipartisan bill that's been dropped in the House to create a centralized background check system for guns. Predictions on how that, especially with a new Speaker of the House. And the death penalty repeal is another example. Bills that never even got caucused on, much less a vote on the floor of the House. How much does Lori Jenkins being in charge change that?
Centralized background check. There's been studies showing that it would be a good thing to do one system. It'll take a couple $1 million. I think that is the kind of idea that gets through, given what the voters have passed at the initiatives. A high-capacity magazine has been discussed, so maybe they can some way force it through.
I mean, the rule with Frank Chop was it had to have bipartisan. If it was a gun issue, it had to have bipartisan support. Do you think that's going to be the Lori Jenkins test?
I don't think so. I mean, I think she's going to pick each one. I think some of them she's going to say, we've got 57 in our caucus, maybe 1 or 2 on our side, but we've got 75–80% of the voters. We've seen it with the major initiatives, so maybe we can do how many bullets are in the magazine. But a ban, no, it's got to be bipartisan. You want to ban something in no way.
I agree with Jerry. Yes, on the background checks. maybe on magazines, no on assault weapons. I mean, the voters just passed something on assault weapons, semi-automatic rifles,
yeah.
which everybody described as assault weapons, but that's not what the law says. But there are people who are going to easily say, let's let what the voters said have a few years and see what happens.
So is there, just in the 2 minutes we have left, something specific you're watching besides Matt Shea, given that you're writing for a Spokane area audience?
Well, the things that we talked about, guns and transportation, because one of those paused projects is the North Spokane corridor,
Which has been going on or waiting for years.
Yeah, I mean, like say the 1940s, I think. So there are also some mass transit projects in that money that's being paused that are important to Spokane. So I'll be watching that, and of course homelessness.
Anything in your readership area?
Tabs. The governor said he's open to reform. Lawmakers say it. We'll see if reform happens. And then the whole fight around data privacy. I'm still trying to understand, but the House and Senate, it blew up on the issue last session, and it's already feeling like it could blow up again, or it could come together in one of the big achievements this session.
Yeah, data privacy, facial recognition, software regulations and rules, both seem like they're teed up. Any last predictions for just it's an election year? Does seem like everybody's asserting themselves a little bit more partisan-like?
My advice to everybody when they say how long will the legislature last, usually I say never bet the under, always bet the over. I think they will get out on time this year.
I'll go with that only because in the end, even on transportation, the issue people are concerned they could punt on that until next year.
Okay. Jerry Cornfield, Jim Camden, thank you both for coming in to talk about these issues, our reporters panel. Thank you for watching Inside Olympia, and we will see you again next week.
Support for Inside Olympia provided by
Unaware of nearby predators, the zebra starts to trot.
A commitment to strong communities. That's what PEMCO Insurance is all about. Since 1949, from Linden to Longview, Walla Walla to West Seattle, we put our members first, making sure we give back so we can all move ahead. Whether it's providing a chance for those who might not otherwise have one, or supporting TVW to help improve our corner of the world, PEMCO cares about the same things you do. We believe in TVW's mission and in transparent government, because informed citizens benefit all of us.
BECU,